This is Lesson 18.2, Children and Education. What was life like for children, and how did attitudes towards childhood evolve? We've got College Board Topic 4.1. We've seen it before, contextualizing the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. That's still really our big picture, explaining the context in which the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment developed in Europe. The experiences of everyday life were shaped by demographic, environmental, medical, and technological changes. By the 18th century, family and private life reflected new demographic patterns and the effects of the commercial revolution. So this is something we've already seen. And then we've got this topic 4.4, 18th century society and demographics. I think we've seen this as well. Explain the factors contributing to and the consequences of demographic changes from 1648 to 1815. As infant and child mortality decreased and commercial wealth increased, families dedicated more space and resources to children and child rearing, as well as private life and comfort. And then it says, explain how and why the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment challenged the existing European order and understanding of the world. Introduction. In this lesson, we're going to talk about people we don't talk about very much, children. They're always there, lurking in the background. How were they raised, nurtured, and educated into becoming productive adults? Now, this might seem like a boring topic at the outset, but we're going to explore issues that people have very strong opinions about and very strong emotions about, even today, 250 to 300 years later. So as we talk about these very, very hot topics, don't kill the messenger. I'm just the facilitator. Don't blame me. These issues can be a huge source of stress for parents, especially mothers who want to get raising children right. Mothers are surrounded by people who are not at all shy about their opinions. And that's true today in the developed world. And if you go back to the 18th century in Europe, you can add that to the strain of a very high infant mortality rate and a very high mother's mortality rate. A large part of Enlightenment thought was dedicated to these issues, particularly the issue of nurturing children. John Locke and his tabula rasa are one example. Jean-Jacques Rousseau wrote an entire book on it. And these Enlightenment ideals began to gain a lot of traction in the second half of the 18th century, so after 1750. And as we discussed in Lesson 18.1, 1750 seems to have marked a major social turning point. Child rearing, child nurturing, child development, and especially education were areas in which religious institutions sought to exert influence. If young minds were to be developed and indoctrinated, it needed to be according to the right values and purposes. Religious institutions of all kinds, both Catholic and Protestant, were eager to establish these goals, particularly in elementary education, and these efforts eventually prompted the state to get involved. Child care and nursing. Keep in mind that we're talking about the 18th century, not today, although we will talk about today quite a bit. And this is an area of great anxiety for mothers who want to do the right thing. Many people come at them with forceful opinions about what to do. Doctors, nurses, relatives, how-to books, the internet, the latest and greatest fad. And many of you will be parents one day and will have to navigate these issues as well. In many ways, it's like being an educator. Some of you will be educators someday. And educators get continually blasted with all kinds of strong opinions about how they should be teaching from other teachers, from the latest gadget, from the latest theory, from the latest professional development session. And they're constantly getting the message that you are doing too much of this or too little of that, or you're not using the latest platform or the latest piece of technology, and what is wrong with you? You are lazy, you're negligent, you're behind the times, you're inadequate, and you're failing at this. Well, today, pretty much everyone in medicine agrees, for example, that nursing your own baby is the best option for a variety of reasons. However, a certain number of mothers, for a number of different reasons, are simply not in a position to do that. And today, in the developed world, in the 21st century, science and technology have given mothers options that are, if not ideal in a perfect world, are at least viable and safe for the child. This was not the case back in the 18th century. As we know, infant mortality was very high, and the biggest threat was dehydration due to diarrhea. The dangers of having children. It didn't matter much whether you were rich or poor. The risk of death for mothers was 5 to 10%. That's about 1,000 times what it is in Europe today. And that's per pregnancy every time you had a child. So it was like playing Russian roulette. The three biggest dangers were blood loss, shock, and infections. And there was no germ theory, and there was no antiseptic. If you breastfed your baby for 2 or more years, that was going to delay your next pregnancy, and that was going to space your children out further. However, there were certain areas in Europe where it was very common not to nurse your own children. Northern France, Scandinavia, Eastern and Central Europe, and there are several reasons for this. Some actually thought it was unhealthy to nurse your own baby. Some thought it ruined their physical appearance. Some thought it was undignified. And some simply thought that it cramped their lifestyle with all of their social obligations. The three biggest alternatives to breastfeeding were cow's milk, goat's milk, and wet nursing. And in rural areas, wet nursing was a cottage industry in its own right. Instead of spinning thread, these women breastfed other people's babies for money. Paris, in the second half of the 18th century, is a good example. 20,000 babies were born in Paris each year. Almost 50% of those were wet nursed in some kind of government-supervised network. I know, it's hard to believe. 20 to 25% were placed in the homes of wet nurses chosen by the parents. Another 20 to 25% were abandoned foundlings that hospitals farmed out to rural wet nurses. And 10% were nursed at home either by the mother or a live-in nurse. The mortality rate rose dramatically with the level of wet nursing. There were a variety of reasons. The danger of traveling. There was the lack of supervision. There was the need of wet nurses to share breast milk. And people knew this was a problem. A mid-1700s study in France had some alarming findings. 25% of French babies died in infancy, and then an additional 30% of French children died before the age 10. That's 55%. In England, at the same time, only 30% of children died before the age of 10. Total. France was losing almost twice as many children before age 10 as England was. And everybody knew that more English mothers nursed their own babies. Infant mortality rates were highest in these times and places: urban places, marshy places, and in the summer months because women were too busy harvesting. Women who did not nurse their own children tended to have significantly more children. They got pregnant again more quickly. Women whose children died in infancy tended to become pregnant again more quickly. So the number of children kind of evened out. Women who did not nurse their own children tended to have more children than those that did. So even though they lost many more children, the number of children that managed to make it to adulthood was about the same. Around 1750, wet nursing was coming under severe attack from Enlightenment thinkers. They understood that a nation that didn't have enough children was not going to last very long. It was going to be in a lot of trouble. And they lay the blame on wet nursing. Many women simply refused to listen, and they preferred to take their chances doing it the way they always had. Foundlings and infanticide. What if a young mother simply could not provide for a baby? What if she had no husband, no prospects for marriage, no support from family? Abortions were rare. Today, one argument that is used in favor of pro-choice is that if women can't get an abortion legally, they will have no choice but to get one in a manner that is dangerous. Well, in the 18th century, abortions were dangerous under any circumstances, legal or not. So the prevailing wisdom was, we need to make abortion illegal so as to discourage women from even attempting it. But the fact that it was so dangerous was probably the bigger reason that abortions were so rarely done, not the illegality. The much bigger issue and controversy back then was not abortion, but rather infanticide. Typically, the woman would manage to hide the pregnancy and then go off to an isolated place alone. She would have the baby and then either smother it or leave it out to die of exposure. And infanticide was often punishable by death. Again, we see a big turning point around 1750. In the first half of the 18th century, everyone thought that the way to reduce crime was to punish people for it. In other words, you reduce crime by making examples of those who did the crime, thus deterring everyone else. That's why many punishments were publicly held spectacles. And that was why infanticide was punishable by death throughout Europe. There was little recognition given to the social and economic factors that were actually driving the problem, such as poverty and lack of equality and unemployment and lack of education. And in our own culture, we tend to be staunch believers, even today, that harsh punishment deters crime. But in the second half of the 18th century, after 1750 or so, Enlightenment ideals were starting to permeate society. People started to think about other ways to reduce the problem. For example, homes for abandoned children. These actually began before the Enlightenment in Catholic and Southern Europe, but now they started to spread north with support from the Enlightenment. In the 1770s, in Paris alone, 1/3 of all babies born were immediately taken to foundling hospitals. And of that 1/3, about another third, so 1/6 total, were abandoned by married couples. What was done with the children in these homes? Well, just keeping them alive was a serious challenge. Between 50% and 90% of babies didn't survive the first year in these places. And then the next step was to provide them with some sort of education that would enable them to get an apprenticeship or work as a domestic servant. Jean-Jacques Rousseau had 5 illegitimate children of his own. He put them all in foundling homes, just as Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and all 5 are thought to have died in these places. However, the good news was that convictions for infanticide dropped significantly in the second half of the 18th century, and that was the real goal. Connecting to the now, here is some potential fuel for a free response question on this topic, like a DBQ or an LEQ should you encounter one. It can also be used to get the complex understanding point for such an essay. There are still cases of suspected infanticide today. The sensational ones make the news if they involve a high school cheerleader who does way too much texting. Brooke Schuyler Richardson was found not guilty of infanticide in 2017 because the state could not prove that her baby was born alive, and she and her family were actually vilified by the prosecution and the media to the point where they even got death threats. Until June of 2022, abortion was constitutionally protected with some restrictions. A Supreme Court, which is well documented to have been captured by right-wing corporate interests, overturned that right as a constitutional right in Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization, and many states have since instituted laws banning it. A good book to read about the Supreme Court's capture is a book called The Scheme by U.S. Senator Sheldon Whitehouse. There are people with very strong convictions about abortion all over the spectrum. On one end, you have people who see it purely as a women's rights or women's equality issue. They view pregnancy as a simple medical condition like any other. They view a fetus as having no moral status as an actual person. They argue that the life of an unborn has no rights unless the mother chooses to give birth to it. Years before she became a Supreme Court justice herself, Ruth Bader Ginsburg argued that if you could not have both gender equality and protection for the unborn, then gender equality had to be the higher imperative for the well-being of our society. On the other end of the spectrum, you have people who believe that a life is a person from as early as the moment of conception, in which case that life has the rights of a person, and therefore an abortion is a violation of its human rights. There is a spectrum of viewpoints that people can have as to exactly when a life attains the moral status of personhood. There's conception, there's heartbeat, there's viability, a certain number of weeks, a certain trimester, birth, etc. And people's views can change over time. Let's look at Roe v. Wade. The recently overturned Roe v. Wade was the landmark 1973 Supreme Court case that protected abortion rights nationally. If you believe that the unborn have human rights, it's tempting to believe that the easiest and most efficient pathway toward protecting those rights is to overturn Roe v. Wade and take options away from pregnant women, which is what happened in June 2022 with that Dobbs decision. However, if you take a historical view and compare it to what we just saw 18th century Europe doing to reduce infanticide, you might conclude that giving pregnant women more options and more support could actually save more pregnancies. The easy way is to simply make abortions illegal and put the burden of fixing the issue upon an already strained justice system and an already strained law enforcement system. Generally speaking, though, once these legal institutions are involved in these cases, the opportunity to save the situation would have already passed. That's why there would be a legal case in the first place. Rates of abortion and rates of teen pregnancy. The rates of abortion and teen pregnancy have actually declined significantly in this country over the last few years. You may have thought just the opposite. No one is exactly sure why these rates are going down. Most agree that there are multiple independent causes rather than just one cause, and restrictions on abortions are just one of the possible causes, along with more access to contraception and more education. Attitudes towards children in the 18th century. So we're finally back to going through history again. Historians used to believe that parents in the pre-industrial world treated their small children with indifference. In this way, they would not invest their emotions too heavily in their children, and then they could blunt their grief if the child died, which, as we know, was pretty likely. Nowadays, though, historians have altered that view a lot. New evidence, such as letters and diaries and portraits, are constantly being rediscovered. And now we know that 17th and 18th century parents were really just as loving and caring toward their children as we are today. Discipline could be severe. The idea that children were cognitively different from adults was just starting to take shape in the Enlightenment. People viewed children simply as little adults. They even dressed children as little adults. There was no baby gap. There was no gymboree. So childhood willfulness and immaturity were seen as coming from his or her sinful nature. And a child's sinful nature had to be broken through harsh discipline and domination. Spare the rod, spoil the child. Our textbook suggests that this saying seems to have originated in the mid-17th century. However, this saying probably originated with the book of Proverbs 13:24, which says, "He who spares the rod hates his son." In other words, if you love your children, you'll suck it up and discipline them even if you don't want to. Then the Enlightenment came around with these new ideals that challenged traditional assumptions. Enlightenment philosophers saw themselves as having surpassed any kind of scholarship that had come before. And Enlightenment thinkers also believed that they were going to create a new enlightened society. What place makes a more logical start than the realm of child rearing? So it's really no surprise that Enlightenment thinkers were studying this area intensely. As we know, the Enlightenment supported the establishment of foundling homes. And as we know, the Enlightenment supported breastfeeding. In addition, the Enlightenment rejected the idea of original sin, the idea that all human beings are born into a fallen, sinful world. Deism, the religious view most closely related to the Enlightenment, also rejected the idea of original sin. It embraced a more natural religion, as we know. The Enlightenment thinkers argued that childhood was a unique and natural stage of development. Instead of trying to suppress that stage of development, parents needed to nurture and protect that stage. And parents needed to allow that stage to do its thing. In keeping with this view, Enlightenment thinkers advocated things like getting rid of tight adult-style clothing and corsets for kids. Instead, children needed clothes designed to fit their needs as children. These clothes had to be comfortable and loose so that the children could run and play and explore unhindered by restrictive clothing. Jean-Jacques Rousseau's book, Emile, or On Education, is a good example of these arguments. It was published in 1762. You can download it for free on your Kindle. Rousseau was the Enlightenment philosopher who abandoned all 5 of his illegitimate children, and all of them died in foundling homes. And Jean-Jacques Rousseau was also the anti-Enlightenment philosopher who emphasized the value of feelings and intuition over the Enlightenment obsession with reason and empiricism that his fellow philosophers had. One of the things that Jean-Jacques Rousseau said was that boys and girls needed to be educated according to their different natures. Many, if not all, Enlightenment thinkers had views that we would consider very sexist today. And the Enlightenment is actually notorious for that, as we've seen. Boys needed an education that struck a balance between book learning and practical skills. Girls were thought to have needed an education that focused on getting them ready for their future domestic responsibilities. Jean-Jacques Rousseau said that he wrote the book out of remorse for what he had done to his own children. Rousseau almost certainly saved many more lives than his earlier negligence had taken. The book was extremely popular, and Rousseau encouraged parents to invest more of themselves in the raising of their own children, and he encouraged women to nurse their own children. Jean-Jacques Rousseau's efforts deeply impacted a whole new cultural movement, and this movement was called Romanticism. Rousseau was one of the only Enlightenment philosophers that the Romantic movement actually accepted and admired. Romanticism hated the vast majority of Enlightenment philosophers. Rousseau's emphasis upon emotion and intuition, as well as the innocence of childhood, became 2 major pillars of Romanticism, as we will soon find out. Elementary schools. 2 groups pioneered elementary education: the wealthy and the Jesuits. Then schools for the children of common people began to appear in the second half of the 17th century. Both boys and girls learned literacy and religion. Boys learned some math, Girls learned needlework, and these expanded throughout the 18th century, but they never expanded enough to teach the majority of kids. The role of religious institutions. Let's start with the Presbyterians in Scotland. Presbyterian schools began in Scotland around the mid-17th century, and their purpose was to teach kids to be able to read Scripture, and they educated all classes of children. In Protestant Prussia, beginning in 1717, Prussia started making elementary schools compulsory for both boys and girls. And they had two objectives. Number one, to enable Protestant children to read the Bible, and number two, to prepare the population to serve the Prussian state. Other German Protestant states started following suit, like Saxony and Württemberg. What about the Catholic countries? Well, these countries began in the 1660s. France, for example, in 1660, France started setting up these, what they called charity schools for poor kids. And the purposes of these schools were this: learning the catechism, and that's preparation for communion and confirmation, prayers, reading, and writing. And these schools were run by either a priest or an educational teaching order. For example, the Brothers of the Christian Schools. By the 1780s, they were teaching 35,000 students. The Habsburg Empire. The Austrians found what the Prussians were doing with their children to be alarming. What might all of this elementary education lead to in 1 or 2 generations in these competing states to the north, especially Prussia? So, in 1774, Maria Theresa issued a compulsory education edict. Children would have 5 days of school, 5 hours per day, from ages 6 to 12.